In this section, we're going to look at implementing routing and navigation. So by the end of this section, you will have an in-depth understanding of how routing works in Angular, and you'll be able to add navigation to your Angular apps. More specifically, you're going to learn about configuring routes, implementing single-page applications, working with route and query parameters, and programmatic navigation. Now, let's get started. So far, you have seen a few of the built-in modules in Angular. We have used the Forms module, the Reactive Forms module, the HTTP module, and now it's time to explore another module. That is the Router module. So in this module, we have a bunch of directives and services that we use for implementing navigation in our applications. You're going to learn about this module throughout this section. Now, there are 3 steps to implement navigation. First, we need to configure the routes in our application. Each route determines what component should be visible when the user navigates to a certain URL. So a route is the mapping of a path to a component. Second, we need to add a router outlet. And that is where we display the corresponding component when a given route becomes active. And finally, we need to add links. So over the next few lectures, we're going to explore each of these steps in detail. So here's a simple application we're going to work on throughout this section. On the top, we have a navigation bar with 2 links, followers and posts. The followers page is what we had as an exercise in the section about consuming HTTP services. So note the URL in the browser's address bar. That is /followers. When we click on a follower, we go to a different URL. That is profile / and here we have 2 parameters. The first one is the username and the second one is the user ID. And after that, we have a query string. So we have a question mark with 1 query string parameter, which is foo. So you're going to learn how to implement routes with multiple parameters and query strings in this section. Now we also have another link on our navigation bar, that is posts, which takes us to our posts page. And note that the URL is /posts. So the first step to implement this navigation is to configure our routes. Now back in our project, I'm going to go to app module and configure our routes. Now if you want to code along with me, download the zip file I've attached to this lecture. Then run npm install to install all the node packages, and then ng serve. Okay? All right, now let's go to app.module. So the first thing I want you to note here is that in the declarations array, you're going to see a few new components. So we've got navbar component, which is a very simple bootstrap navigation component. Let me show you. So navbar.html. Very simple markup that I copied from Bootstrap website. So on this navigation bar, we have 2 links, followers and posts. Now back in app module, the other components here are home component, GitHub profile component, and not found component. These are really basic components. There is no code, there is no markup. I simply generated these with Angular CLI for the purpose of this section. Now, one more thing I want you to pay attention to is that here we have an import statement to import the router module from Angular/router. So we have imported our router module. Now we're ready to define our routes. So let's go to the imports array right here. We're going to call router module dot for route. For route is a static method defined in the router module class, and we use this to define the route routes for our application. Now, as our application grows, we may want to break that application into smaller, more manageable modules. Then in each module, we're going to have a set of routes for that particular area of the application. Then instead of using for route, we're going to use for child. You're going to see this later in the course. So for now, don't worry about it. So back to for route. Here we pass an array of routes. Each route is an object with 2 properties. One is path, and the other is component. With this, we're telling Angular Router that whenever the browser address changes to this path, display this component. So here I'm going to add the first route for our home page. So the component should be home component. And note that here we don't have a leading slash. So none of our routes start with a slash. And an empty path represents the home page or the default route. Now, let's add a comma here and duplicate this. The second route is for our followers page. So followers, and the component is followers, GitHub followers component. Let's duplicate this again. Now, when we click on a follower, we want to see their profile. So here for the third route, the path should be something like this, profile. Now here we want to add a parameter. So slash, and to add a parameter, we use colon. And then we add the name of the parameter. So username. So in this path, we have a parameter called username that will be placed dynamically at runtime. You're going to see this later in this section. Now the component should be GitHub profile component. Okay. Now we can reformat this code. It's cleaner, easier to the eyes. All right, this is much better. Now two more routes. So let me duplicate this last route. I'm going to change the path to posts and the component to posts component. Now, if the user navigates to a different URL that is not a valid route, we want to display a typical not found page. So let's duplicate this one more time. Now for the path, I'm going to use 2 asterisks. This represents a wildcard, and this basically catches any URLs in the browser address bar. So here I'm going to change the component to not found component. Now the order of these routes is important. So if I put this last route at the beginning of our routes array, this pattern, this wildcard is going to catch any routes, and we're only going to see the not found page. As another example, let's change the path for this route to followers/username. So now with this configuration, when we navigate to followers/anything, the path in the first route here will match the URL, and as a result, GitHub followers component will be displayed. In other words, with this configuration, we will not be able to look at the profile of a given follower. So we need to put the more specific routes on the top. So I'm going to move this on top of the followers route. So cut from here and paste it here. So now the first route is more specific. And if you have a URL with this pattern, this route will be active and GitHub profile component will be displayed. So this is how we define routes. Next, we're going to look at router outlet. So we have defined our routes here in app module. Now, if we switch over to the browser, we're going to see an error. So our generic error handler just kicked in and displayed this alert. Now let's take a look at the console. So we have this error. Cannot find primary outlet to load home component. So as I told you before, the second step to implement routing is to add a router outlet. And that's where Angular Router is going to display the component that is associated with the current route. So let's go to app.html. So currently we only have the navigation bar. Now below that, I'm going to add a router outlet element. This is a directive that is defined in the router module. When Angular sees this, it's going to render the component associated with the current route after this router outlet. So it's not going to render it inside this element. Let me show you. So back in the browser. All right, we don't currently have any errors. Let's inspect this page. So body, we have app root, we have our nav bar, here's our router outlet, and this is our home component. So you can see that it's not rendered inside router outlet. It's rendered after this element. All right, now back to the page. Let's test our routes. So currently we are at localhost port 4200. And as you can see, our home component is visible. Now, if I change this URL to /followers, we get the list of followers. Beautiful. So this route is working properly. If I change this to followers/1, we get the profile page. Perfect. So our more specific route is working. Now, if I change this to posts, we get our posts page. Beautiful. And finally, if I change this to an invalid URL, we get the not found page. So all the routes are working properly. Next, we need to add links. So as we click on these links in the navigation bar, we get the right page. Currently, this is not working properly. Now we're ready to add links. So let's go to navbar.html. So currently we have two links on the navigation bar, followers and posts. And each of these links, as you can see, has an href attribute. In Angular applications, we don't use this attribute. Let me show you why. So I'm going to change the value of this href attribute to /followers. And similarly for the second link, I'm going to change this to /posts. Let's see what happens when we use the href attribute. So back in the browser. So currently we are on the home page, but you can see the followers link in the navigation bar is highlighted. I know this is a little bit confusing. Don't worry about that, as we're going to fix this in the next lecture. But note that when I click on the links in the navigation bar, the page is going to flicker. So I click on followers. Did you see the page flickered? It went blank for a split second. You're going to see this again. So I'm going to click on posts. Look. Now this was too fast. You probably didn't see it. Let me click on followers one more time. With this kind of navigation, every time we click on a link, the entire page is downloaded and the Angular app is reinitialized. That's why the page goes blank for just a split second. Now, as your application grows, as you have more code, the cost of startup is going to be higher. So that delay will be even more. Now, if you look at the browser network tab, so every time we click on any of these links here, all the resources in our application are re-downloaded. So as an example, you can see all our JavaScript bundles are re-downloaded every time we click on a link. This is something we want to avoid at all costs. Otherwise, there is no point using Angular to build modern applications. When we click on a link, we want only the content for the new page to be downloaded, not the entire application, not all the resources. So to fix this problem, instead of the href attribute, we're going to use a directive called router link. So I'm going to replace this with router link. And similarly here, router link. This directive is also defined in the router module. Now let's go back to the browser. Here, first I'm going to refresh the page. Now open up the network tab. These are all the resources that are downloaded the first time we open the application. Now I'm going to clear all the items in this list. Okay. Now let's see what happens when we click on any of the links in the navigation bar. So I'm going to click followers. First of all, we didn't have a flickering effect. The navigation bar stayed there. The page didn't go blank. Only the content area was reloaded. Now let's go back to the network tab one more time. Here you can only see the request for the content of the followers page. So these are the images of my followers. In this list, you're not going to see any JavaScript bundles re-downloaded. And you can verify this by filtering for JavaScript files. Look, there is no JavaScript files. There is no CSS files. All of these resources were downloaded only the first time. So we refer to applications built this way as single page applications. So essentially, a single page is downloaded from the server, and as the user navigates from one page to another, only the content of the target page is downloaded. So single page applications or SPAs. Now, before we finish this lecture, let's go to our followers page and add a link for each follower. So followers.html. So here we have a link for each follower. I'm going to replace this href with router link. However, this time we're dealing with a dynamic URL. So we don't want to send the user to a page like followers/1. This parameter should be rendered dynamically. When we are dealing with route parameters, instead of using the router link as an attribute, we should use the property binding syntax. So, property binding. And here, instead of binding this to a string, we should bind it to an expression. In this expression, we have an array. The first element in this array is the path. So that is /followers. After this first element, we add all the route parameters. So currently we have only one route parameter, so we can add that here. Follower.login if you want to render the username, or follower.id. It doesn't make a difference here. So save, back in the browser. Now here, if I click the first follower, we get to the profile page and note the URL in the browser's location bar. So to recap, for simple routes, you can use the router link directive as an attribute and set it to a string value. If you're dealing with route parameters, you should use the property binding syntax and set the value of this property to an array. The first element in this array is the path, and the subsequent elements are route arguments. So currently we have a problem in this application. The followers link in the navigation bar is always highlighted. So if you go somewhere else, the followers link is still active. Let's see how we can fix this problem. In navbar.component.html, here we have this class active. This is part of Bootstrap. So if you apply the active class on an LI in a navigation bar, the corresponding link will be highlighted. Now we want to apply this dynamically. So we have another directive called router link active. So just like we have router link, we also have router link active. And as the value here, we set a string that includes a list of CSS classes that should be applied when this link is active. So here we have only one CSS class that is active. We can add more, space, current. So all these classes should be separated by a space. Now, similarly, I'm going to apply the same directive to the second LI like this. Now let's test the application. Back in the browser. So currently we are on the posts page, and you can see the posts link in the navbar is selected. If I click on followers, now the followers link is active. And if we inspect this element, so here's the LI for this link. Look at the class attribute. Here we have two classes, active and current. So we use the router link active to set the CSS class for the selected links in the navigation bar. So in app module, we have defined this route that takes a parameter, username. Let me show you how we can extract this parameter in our GitHub profile component. Because in a real-world application, most likely we want to get this parameter and use a service to get the profile of the given user. So let's go to GitHub profile.ts. So here in GitHub profile component, in order to get access to route parameters, we need to inject the activated route class in our constructor. So here I add a parameter called route of type activated route. This is a service that is defined in Angular/router library and is part of the router module that we imported earlier in this section. Now here in ng-on-init, we can get the route parameters from this object. So this, the route.param_map. That's the property that gives us all the parameters in this route. Now look at the type of this property. It's an observable of param_map. You have seen observables in the section about consuming HTTP services. So you know that these observables have a method called subscribe. We can subscribe to them and get values emitted in these observables. So here I'm going to call the subscribe method. You can see that here we need to pass a function that takes a parameter of type param_map and returns void. So let's add an arrow function here, param_map, or we can call it params. It's shorter. Goes to a code block. Now let's log this on the console and see what is inside this object. So console.log params. Save. Back in the browser. So here in the list of followers, I'm going to click the first follower. Now let's take a look at the console. So this is the object we get. It has two properties, keys and params. Let's look at the keys. So here we have only one key, and that is username. Because in app module, we set the name of our parameter to username. Okay? Now this object also has another property that is params. And here we have key value pairs for route parameters and their values. So this is the structure of a param_map object. Now back here in ng_on_init, let's look at the members defined in this class. So params dot, we have get all, has, and keys. You saw the keys field. This field returns all the keys or all the route parameters. We use the get method to get the value of a given route parameter. We use get all to get the value of all route parameters, and has to see if we have a parameter by the given name in this object. So here, to get the value of the username parameter, we call the get method like this. Get username. And by the way, what we have here is actually not username, it's user ID. So always pay great attention to naming your route parameters, because otherwise you can create confusion for other developers, and this will also increase the cost of maintenance of your applications. So let's go back to app.module and change the name of this parameter to ID. Now back in GitHub profile component, here we need to get the value of the ID parameter. Now this method, as you can see here in the IntelliSense, returns a string. If you need to work with a number, a technique that we use in JavaScript is to put a plus before this. This will convert this string to a number. Now we can store it in a variable like ID. And in a real-world application, we most likely send this to a service to get the profile of this user. Something like this, service.getProfile, and we give it this ID. Now we don't need this for now, so let's simply log this on the console. Let's test the application one more time. So here we have the user ID displayed in the console. Now if I go back to the followers list and click on a different user, now in console we have two entries. So this is how we get the route parameters. But you might be wondering why this param_map is defined as an observable. This makes it a little bit hard to access these parameters. How come we don't have an API like this? So this .route of ID. This would be much easier, right? Or potentially we could have this .route.param_map of ID. This is easier to work with than an observable. So in the next lecture, I'm going to answer this question. In order for you to understand why route parameters are defined as observables, first we need to look at what happens to our components during navigation. So let's say the user is on a page, and on this page we have component A. Now they click on a link or a button to go to a different page where we display component B. In this case, Angular is going to destroy component A, remove it from the DOM, and then it's going to create an initialized component B and render its template in the DOM. Also, to refresh your memory, we have component lifecycle hooks. So earlier I told you about the onInit and onDestroy interfaces. So if you want to be notified when a component is initialized or destroyed, you can implement these interfaces and add the corresponding methods in your components. So this is component lifecycle during navigation. Now let's take a look at a different scenario. So imagine we have a link or a button on component A that allows the user to navigate away from this page, but also get to the same page. What is a real-world example of this? Well, imagine you're building a banking application where the user can see all their transactions and the details of each transaction. On the transaction detail page, we have two buttons, previous and next. When the user clicks on either of these buttons, they go to the previous or the next transaction, and technically they are on the same page. So in this case, it doesn't make sense for Angular to destroy this component only to recreate it straight away after. So in this particular use case, what we have is the same component instance, but with different route parameters. So Angular is not going to destroy this component and is going to keep it in the DOM. And this is exactly the reason why route parameters are defined as observables. And this brings us to a different level of understanding about observables. An observable is technically a collection of asynchronous data that arrives over time. In the section about consuming HTTP services, we simply subscribe to an observable to get the response from the server. In that particular case, we had only one item or one object in our observable. That was the response from the server. But we can use observables to model streams of asynchronous data. So data comes into this stream, and anyone who has subscribed to this observable will be notified. Now, as a real-world example, here in GitHub profile component, we are subscribing to this param map observable. So GitHub profile component is an observer of this observable. Anytime there is new data in this collection, GitHub profile component will be notified. As a metaphor, think of a mailing list. When you subscribe to a mailing list on a blog, every time there is a new post, you will be notified. We have the exact same concept here. So we are subscribing to this param map, which is a collection of route parameters that can change over time. And every time there is a new route parameter, we'll be notified. Now, to help you better understand what happens to components lifecycle during navigation, I'm going to temporarily delete this code. And here in ng-on-init, I'm going to log something in the console. GitHub profile on init. Now back in the browser, if there is anything in the console, I want you to clear it right now. Now back here, I'm going to click on the first follower. So this takes us to the GitHub profile page. During this navigation, the old component, which was the followers component, was destroyed. And this new component, which is GitHub profile, was initialized and placed in the DOM. So now if you look at the console, we have this message, GitHub profile on init. Okay? Now if I go back to the followers page again, that component is now destroyed and is no longer in the DOM. Instead, we have the followers component. Now let's click on the second follower. Back in the console, now we have two messages for GitHub profile on init. So this shows that every time we navigate away from this page and go to the followers list and come back, this component is reinitialized. Okay? Now I want to show you what happens when we give the user the ability to stay on the same component and navigate back and forward. So we're not going to navigate away from this component. This component is going to stay in the DOM, but the route parameters are going to change. And this is what I want you to pay great attention to. With this new implementation, we're going to see only one on-init message in the console because the component instance is not going to be reinitialized. It's going to stay in the DOM. So let me show you. First, let's go to GitHub profile.html. On this page, I'm going to add a button like a next or a previous button. So a button with two classes. Let's call it next. And here I'm going to bind the router link property to this array. The path is /followers. And as a route parameter or as a route argument, I'm going to supply some magic number here. It doesn't matter. When we click this button, we'll be on the same page, but the route parameter is going to change. So let's see this in action. Now back here, first I'm going to go in the console. So currently we have GitHub profile on init. And we see this message the first time we land on this page. Now, if I click the next button, we're not going to get a second on init message. Click. So you can see the route parameter changed, but in the console, we still have only one uninit message. So this verifies that Angular did not destroy this component and recreate it. We have a single instance. So if you have an application with this kind of navigation built into it, because ng uninit is called only once, in order to get access to the route parameters, you need to subscribe to the route map observable. So that's why we have this, the route.parammap.subscribe. So every time we have a new parameter, we can get that here. Params goes to this code block, and here we log params.getID. Let's test this back in the browser. So first, I'm going to clean up the console. I'm going to go to the followers page, click on the first follower, look in the console, we have the ID of the first follower. Now I'm going to click the next button. We're still on the same component, the route parameter changed, and in the console, we have the second ID. So this is the reason we need to subscribe to this observable. But in your applications, if you don't have this kind of scenario, if you don't allow the user to stay on the same page and navigate back and forth, there is a simpler way to get access to route parameters. So if you're 100% sure that the user has to navigate away from this page, go somewhere else and then come back, instead of subscribing to an observable, you can use a snapshot. So here we can use this .route.snapshot.parammap. And this is the actual param map object and not an observable. So we can call the get method to get the ID parameter. Store it here, and then log it in the console. Now we don't need this code anymore. So back in the browser, I'm on the followers page. I'm going to go to the first follower. We are on the profile for the first follower. So we should see their ID in the console, as you can see here. Now, assuming that we don't have this next button here, we always have to go back to the followers list in order to go to a second follower. And because our profile component is reinitialized, we can use the snapshot to get the ID of the second follower. So now in the console, we have two entries. So this is why route parameters are defined as observables. In this lecture, I'm going to show you how to work with routes with multiple parameters. So here on our profile page, look at the URL. We only have the ID of the follower. Now, as a technique to improve search engine optimization, you may decide to add the username of each follower in the URL. Something like this. John Smith / and here's the user ID. This is a technique that Stack Overflow uses for search engine optimization. So look at the URL. We have /questions, / here's the question ID, and next to that, we have the title of the question. So back in app module, let's modify this route and include the follower's username in the path. So I'm going to add a second parameter. Once again, colon, username. Now let's go to the followers page. Followers.html. This is where we render the link for each follower. So here in this array, which we call route parameters array, the first element is a path, and the subsequent elements are route parameters. So currently we only have follower.id. I'm going to add another value here, so follower.login. This is the property that is returned from GitHub that includes the username of each follower. So save. Now let's go to the followers page and click on a follower. Look at the URL. We have the ID and the username of each follower. So this is how we deal with route with multiple parameters. There are times that we want to include optional parameters in our routes. So here's an example. On the followers page, here we have two parameters passed as part of query string. So we have page and order. So these are optional parameters because they are not required for this page to load. So let me show you how to add optional parameters to your routes. Here in navbar component.html, this is where we render the link to the followers page. So here, this router link directive exports a property that we can use in our property binding expression. So we bind query params property to an object. Let me put this on a new line. In this object, we can add all the optional parameters. Like page, we set this to 1, and order to newest. And of course, the value of these keys can be dynamic, so we don't have to hard code them here. Now let's go back to the browser. So I'm going to go to the home page, refresh the page, click the followers, and now we have these two parameters passed in the query string. So this is the sending part. But what about receiving these parameters? Let's go to the followers component. So GitHub followers.ts. So in this component, first we need to inject the activated route service. So private route of type activated route. And then in ng-on-init, we can get these optional parameters very similar to how we got the required parameters. So to get the required parameters, we use this.route.param.map. And as you know, this is an observable, so we can either subscribe to this, or we can use the snapshot if we don't have a scenario where the user can navigate back to the same component. So then we use this.route.snapshot.param.map. And here we can call the get method to get the value of a parameter. So this is for getting the required parameters. Getting the query parameters is very similar, but instead of using the param.map property, we use the query param.map property. So this.route.query param.map. Again, this is an observable that we can subscribe to. We can also use it as part of our snapshot. So this.route.snapshot.query param.map.get, let's say the page number, like this. Now, in a scenario where you're passing the page numbers and their sort order, it is very likely that the user is going to get back to the same component. So somewhere on this page, we're going to have a pagination component with the page numbers. So when the user clicks on a page number, they're going to stay on the same page, but the route parameters are going to change. So that means in most cases, you will have to subscribe to this observable. So let me delete these two lines where we work with the snapshot object. Now here's a question you might have. How can we subscribe to both these observables? Let's say we want to load all the followers in the first page. And currently, we're getting these followers from our service outside our subscription. But in a more realistic implementation, our code is going to look like this. Let's say we have some required parameters here. So we need to subscribe to them. Params goes to, here's a code block. And also we need to get the query parameters, like this. Now here's the question. How can we get both the required and optional query parameters and then call the server to get the list of followers? Well, that's what I'm going to show you in the next lecture. So now let me show you how you can subscribe to two different observables at the same time. This is actually easier than what you might think. So as you learned, an observable is a stream of asynchronous data that arrives over time. Now, instead of having two separate subscriptions to these two observables, we want to combine these observables into a new observable, and then we'll subscribe to that observable. Okay? So back in our GitHub followers component, on the top, I'm going to import observable from rxjs/observable. I'm also going to import one of the factory methods for combining multiple observables. So import RxJS, add observable, and the name of the factory method is combine latest. So this factory method, as you learned in the section about consuming HTTP services, this is a static method on the observable class. We can use this to create a new observable, and then we'll subscribe to that observable, okay? So back in ng on init, I'm going to call observable dot combine latest. Now here we pass an array of different observables. What is the first observable? That is this .route .param map. That's an observable, right? Now what is the second observable? That is this .route .query param map. So now we can combine these two observables, and as a result, we'll get a new observable. And then we can subscribe to this one, okay? Or we don't actually have to store the result in a separate variable. We can make this code cleaner and shorter, so we can immediately subscribe to the result. Now here we need to pass an arrow function just like how we subscribe to a simple observable. So let's say combined goes to, so here combined is an array with two elements. The first element is the latest param map object, and the second element is the latest query param map object. So if I type combined of 0 dot, look, here we have a param map object. And this is the object that is coming from the first observable or the first string. So here we can get all the required parameters. Let's say ID. Now in this particular example, we don't have an ID passed to the followers page, but if you have a page that has both the required and optional query parameters, this is how you can get access to all these parameters. So let's store this here in a variable called ID. And now if we type combined of 1, look, again, we have a param map object, and this object has come from our query param map observable. And with this, we can get all the optional query parameters, like get page. Now that we have the value for all these parameters, we can use our service to get the data from the server. So our code would look something like this. So this, the service, .get all. Now here, our get all method doesn't take any parameters, but let's say here we had a parameter, then we would set the values here, like this. Now let me comment this out and delete the other code here and move this line inside our subscription function. So here's the end result. We combine multiple observables, let's subscribe to that observable, and then use our service to get the data from the server. Now here we have a subscribe inside another subscribe, and this looks a little bit ugly. With reactive extensions, we can rewrite this code in a cleaner and more elegant way. And that's what I'm going to show you in the next lecture. So here we have a subscribe inside another subscribe. And this is a pattern that you may see in a lot of real-world applications. Now I want to show you a better, cleaner, and more elegant way to rewrite this code. Before we get started, let's go to our data service. So this is the data service that we built in the last section, consuming HTTP services. Look at the return type of getAll method. It returns an observable of any. From now on, anytime you see observable, think of a collection. So here we have a collection, and in this collection, every item, its type is any. Okay? Now let's see what happens when I comment out these two lines. Look at the return type of getAll. Now it returns an observable of response. So here we have a collection, and in this collection, we're going to get a response object that arrives asynchronously, okay? But why? Because this get method of the HTTP class returns an observable of response. So because we are returning the result immediately, that's why the return type of getAll method is also observable of response. Now let's see what happens when we apply the map operator. Let's look at the return type of this method. Now instead of observable of response, we get observable of any, because we're mapping the response object to a new object of type any. Because when we call this JSON method, look, it returns an object of type any. So here's one way to visualize what happened here. Initially, we had an observable of response. So every object, every item in this observable or in this collection will be an instance of the response class, okay? We applied the map operator, and as a result, we got a new observable. And in this observable, every item, its type is any instead of response, okay? Now back to our GitHub followers component. Here we're combining two different observables, and then we subscribe to the result. Let's look at the type of the combined parameter. The type of this parameter is param_map_array. And here's a simple way to visualize this. So here we're subscribing to an observable, and every item in this observable is of type param_map_array. Okay? Now, similar to how we use the map operator in our data service, we can use the map operator and map a param_map_array into followers array. So we'll give it this param_map_array as an input, and as the output we'll get the followers array. So here on the top, I'm going to import a couple of operators from RxJS. So I'm going to duplicate this line twice. I'm going to change the second one to add /operator/map. And for the second one, I'm going to use operator/switch_map. You're going to see the difference between these two operators in a second. So back to ng_on_init. After we combine these observables, I'm going to apply the map operator. So what is the input here? That is a param_map_array, right? So let's call this combined, goes to. Now let's verify the type of this parameter. So we can see it's param_map_array. And if we didn't have this map operator here, and directly subscribe to that observable again, you would get a param_map_array object, right? Now let's bring this map operator back. So we get this param_map_array object, and at this point we want to call the server to get the list of followers and return them. And then we'll subscribe to that observable, and as the result, we'll have the array of followers. So this code we have here in the subscribe, I'm going to cut it and move it inside the map operator. So cut, put this here. Now we don't need this subscribe anymore, because in this map operator, the intention is to return the list of followers. So later below when we subscribe, we'll have the list of followers, okay? So delete. And we don't need this commented code. So here in the subscribe method, we should get the list of followers. And then use this to set this.followers. Now we have a compilation error, and I'm going to show you how to fix this in a second. But what I want to point out here is that with this new implementation, we don't have a subscribe inside another subscribe. We use the map operator to transform the objects in our observables. Now let's see what is this compilation error. Type void is not assignable to type any array. So if you look at the type of these followers, you can see it's void. Why is that? Because here in this map function, we are not returning anything. So the return type is void. And when we subscribe to this, it's like we are subscribing to an observable or a collection where every item is void. So here we want to return something, and what we return from this map function will be the input into our subscribe method, okay? So here we want to return the output of our service. Return. Now what is coming out of this function will be the input into the subscribe method. Let's check the type of this followers parameter again. So it's no longer void. but is observable of any. And we still have a compilation issue. Let's see a visualization of what we have done here. So we use the map operator to convert a param map array object into an observable of any. Because this service here, this getAll method, look, it returns an observable of any. So because here we're returning an observable of any, this will be the input to the subscribe method. And that's why the type of followers is observable of any. In other words, when we subscribe to this observable, every item in this observable is going to be an observable of any. It's like we have a collection inside another collection. Or in other words, it's like every item in a collection is another collection. So we ended up with a hierarchy. What we want in the subscribe method is a followers array, not observable of followers array. Okay? So to fix this problem, instead of the map operator, we're going to use switch map. So let's change this to switch map. And the compilation error is gone. Now, if you hover your mouse over this followers parameter, you can see its type is any, which in this case is the followers array. Also, if you look at the switch map method, you can see it returns an observable of any. So when we subscribe to an observable of any, every item in this observable or every item in this collection is of type any. Okay? So here's the final result and a more cleaner and elegant way to combine multiple observables, call the server, subscribe to the result, and initialize a field in this class. So far you have seen how we can use the router link directive to add links in various parts of our application. Now there are times that you may want to navigate the user programmatically. For example, here on the profile page, I have added a submit button. When we click this button, imagine we're going to call the server to update the user's profile, and then eventually we want to navigate them back to the list of followers. So when I click this, we're back on the list of followers, and we also have these optional query parameters in the URL. So let me show you how to navigate the user programmatically. So here in GitHub profile component, in the constructor, we need to inject the router service. So private router of type router. Let's import this from Angular/router. So on the top, you can see this is defined in Angular/router library. Now let's implement the submit method. So submit. Here we're going to call this .router.navigate. Now as the first argument, we need to pass an array of link parameters. So the same kind of array we use with the router link directive. The first element is the path, which is /followers. And if we have any required parameters, we'll add them here. Okay. Now in this case, we don't have any required parameters, so I'm going to delete these. Instead, I want to pass the query parameters. So the second argument here is a navigation extra object. In this object, we have a property called query params, and we set this to an object. Here we'll have two properties, page 1 and order newest. Exactly like what we had in the markup. Now let's test this. Back in the browser, I'm going to go to this profile, click submit, and we're back in the list of followers. And you can see the optional parameters in the query string. All right, now it's time for another exercise. So I want you to use what you have learned in this section and build a simple application like this. So here I've created a new project using Angular CLI. And in this application, we have two pages. On the home page, we have a list of dates. Imagine these are the archives for a blog. So each archive has a year and a month. And when we click on an archive, we go to the archive page where we see all the posts in that archive. Now here we don't want to worry about all that complexity. Our focus is entirely on the navigation. So there are a few things I want you to pay attention to while doing this exercise. First of all, note the URL for this page. Here we have two required parameters. year, and month. If I don't supply the value for one of these parameters, we go to the not found page. Okay, now let's go back. The second thing I want you to pay attention to is the heading for this page. So this heading is rendered dynamically based on the parameters passed here. So as part of this exercise, I want you to get the route parameters. We also have a button here, and when we click this, it takes us back to the home page. So as part of this, I want you to implement programmatic navigation. So don't add a link under the button. Make sure that when you click the button, a method in the class is called, and in that method, navigate the user back to the home page. And one last thing, in order to render the list of archives, simply define an array in this class and initialize this array with 3 objects. Each object or each archive object should have 2 properties, year and month. So go ahead, do this exercise, and then you can see my solution. Okay, so I've created a new project using Angular CLI called routing. First, I'm going to generate a few components. So ng-gc home for the home page. Another one, not-found. And finally, archive. Okay. Now let's go to app.module. On the top, first I'm going to import the router module. Router module from Angular/router. Next, we need to configure our routes. So here in the imports array, I'm going to call router module.forRoute. Here we pass an array, and in this array we have our route objects. Each object should have 2 properties, path and component. So here's our default route, which I'm mapping to home component. Let's duplicate this a few times. The second route is going to be archive, and here we should have 2 parameters, year and month. And we want to map this to archive component. And finally, the last route, I'm going to use a wildcard. So if we have any other routes, I want to render the not found component. And we don't need the last one. Next, we need to add a router outlet. So let's go to app.html, which is the container for our application. I'm going to delete all this markup and instead add router outlet. Now let's make sure our routes are configured properly. So back in the browser, here we have the home page, beautiful. Let's go to archive with a year and a month. We get the archive page, and let's go to an invalid URL. So we get the not found page, beautiful. Now let's render the list of archives on the home page. So I'm going to go to home.component.ts. Here I'm going to define a field, archives, and set it to an array of objects. Each object should have 2 properties, year and month. Let's duplicate this, change the months, okay? And then let's go to home.html and render these archives. First, I add a heading here, homepage. Below that, UL. Inside that, we're going to have LI. And here we use ng4 to iterate over our archives. So let archive of archives. Now here we need to add a link. So an anchor. We use interpolation to render the link. And for that, we add archive.year plus a slash and then archive.month. Now here I'm going to use the router link directive, router link. Now, because we need to pass parameters, instead of using this as an attribute and using it as one-time initialization, we need to use the property binding syntax and bind this to an array. The first element is the path, which is /archive. And the subsequent elements are our route parameters. So archive.year and archive.month. Let's test this. So back in the browser, I'm going to go in the home page. Beautiful. We have the list of archives. When I click this, we get to the archive page. Perfect. Next, we need to extract these route parameters and display them on this page. So let's go to archive.component.ts. To get the route parameters, we need to inject activated route here. So private route of type activated route. Now, just one tip here. The first time you use the auto import plugin in a new project, it may not detect the namespace for this type properly. So on the top, you should import this from Angular/router. However, the first time you use this, the auto import plugin may suggest to import this from Angular/router/source. I'm not entirely sure why this happens. Perhaps it's a bug in this plugin. So if that happens, manually change this. And from now on, any type defined in this namespace, you can easily import them with auto import plugin. All right, so we injected this type, activated route. Next, we need to define a couple of fields. Year of type number, same for month. And in ng-on-init, we're going to read the route parameters. Now here, because we don't have a scenario where the user can be on the same page and navigate back and forth with different route parameters, I'm going to use a snapshot. That's easier. So this .route.snapshot.param_map. Now from here, we need to get the year and the month. Now I don't want to repeat this long expression twice. So we can store a reference to this param map in a separate variable with a shorter name. Let's call it params. And then we can call params.getYear and use this to initialize the year field. Now here we have a compilation error because the get method returns a string. But here we have defined year as a number. So as I told you before, we can add a plus here. Now let's duplicate this, change this to month, and this one to month here as well. Or we could use multi-cursor editing. That's faster. Now let's render these fields in our template. So let's go to archive.html. I'm going to delete this, add a heading, archive for, here we add the year, and then the month. Let's test this. Back in the browser. Okay, we have these parameters rendered beautifully. If I change the URL to 2017/2, you can see that's updated here accordingly. And the last step is to add a button and implement programmatic navigation. So here in the template, I'm going to add a button, call it view all, and handle the click event and bind it to the view all method in our component. Let's go to archive component.ts and implement this method. First, we need to inject the router service into the constructor. So private router of type router. And let's import this. You can see the namespace is picked up properly. So it's Angular/router. And finally, let's implement this new method. View all. Here we should call this .router.navigate. And as the first argument, we pass our route parameters array. So here, the first parameter is the path, which I'm going to set to the home page. So note that here we use a leading slash, but when defining our route in app module, we don't use the leading slash, okay? Now, finally, let's test this. So back in the browser, I'm going to click this and we're back on the home page. Beautiful. Now, if you want to have my solution, you can download it from this lecture.